Welcome back to Hidden Heritage. I'm your host, Paul LaRoche. Whether you've been following our journey from the start or just joined us recently, I want to extend a sincere thank you. Since our launch on February 8th, we have presented 9 episodes of the Hidden Heritage series and introduced you to 1 episode of the Brulé Chronicles. Today marks a special milestone as we release episode 10, which I call Growing Up in Worthington. Joining me on this nostalgic journey is none other than my longtime friend and bandmate, Tom Gilmore. Together, we'll reminisce about our shared hometown of Worthington, Minnesota, and the fond memories and adventures that shaped us, including some of the musical escapades. So get ready to take a trip down memory lane. So sit back, relax, as we take this heartfelt journey of our roots. Welcome to Hidden Heritage. I'm here with Tom Gilmore, and in my mind, I'd always kind of envisioned a channel that could be hosted by myself and another individual. And I'm trying to twist Tom's arm into doing this because we have a history. We go back a little bit, and it involves, most of it involves music, the music world. We were in a group together back in the early days, which we'll talk about a little bit more as we get into it. But he's also kind of an outdoorsman, so I know, Tom, that you've got a love for the outdoors. You were an avid climber back in your day, maybe still are, I don't know, but I know that you had a love for places like Wyoming and the Tetons, and I've heard you mention that stuff for years, Black Hills, right?
Yep. Wyoming.
Yeah, well, all that. And so you combine those two things, and those are two of the areas that have a lot to do with at least how our life has been shaped up over the years in terms of Brulé, in terms of the Summers LaRoche family, and in terms of the outdoors when it comes to the culture. So I've talked about this gentleman, Tom Gilmore, a little bit. Tom, why don't you just take a minute here and just let the audience know who you are and how you came to know Summers LaRoche.
Well, I was born in Sioux City, Iowa, but we moved to Worthington, and that's where Paul was living, and at a very young age. And I'm 6 years older, I think. Am I? How old are you?
Yeah, I'm not going to say. No, I'm 69.
Okay, I'm 4 years older than him. Anyhow, I'm not exactly sure how Paul and I met, but they needed a drummer. And at the time, my father had already passed away, and I was running the family business. So I was a so-called businessman. I guess I'm not exactly sure what that means. But we started practicing. We were playing kind of a hard rock band. I think we were called Scarlet at the time. And I've always loved music, and I always was kind of a rocker. And one thing led to another, and we got together, and we started playing. The rest was history. And unbeknownst to either Paul or I, we did not know at the time that he was Lakota Sioux. We were then, I think he was told, I think I've got this right, that you were French Canadian. And so that's kind of what we thought. I guess if I would have known that he was an Indian, I wouldn't have anything to do with him. No, I'm just kidding. Anyhow, so to make a long story short, that's how it all started. And it started way back in, it had to be about 74, maybe.
Yeah. So don't be shy. Now tell them about you were a drummer, right? Back in those days?
I was a drummer. So I played in numerous bands and garage bands. That's how we all started. And
okay, so tell me a little bit about tell me what your earliest memory of the music scene would have been like here in Southwest Minnesota. Because we're coming from Worthington here on this podcast.
Well, we came right in. I'm 73, so the Beatle invasion. I can remember going to the dances when we were in junior high up at the YMCA, and they'd be playing Beatle music and Kinks and Rolling Stones, and we were just these young kids and didn't know what was really going on, and all the parents were upset with the hair and the way they dressed, and that's kind of how we got into it. And Worthington was just a small town, 8,000 people, I suppose, back then.
So what were some of the other bands that were playing? Because you've mentioned this to me before, but I'd like to pick your brain because I don't even remember some of these.
Well, we had bands back then. There was a band called the Blue Things. They were kind of far out, and they'd come to the Coliseum, and they'd play at the Armory. And then probably my all-time favorite band was a band called the Fabulous Flippers, and I think they were from the University of Kansas or somewhere. And then there were the Roaring Red Dogs.
Yeah.
Winston T. Fink and the Uglies, all these kind of bands came through, and you just started playing. I was in school band, and I finally quit that, and we started a garage band. I think the first band I was ever in, we were called the Aardvarks.
And say that again, slow.
The Aardvarks.
Okay, I got you.
Yeah. And we played out in the garage and drove the neighbors crazy, of course, and we probably weren't really very good, but, there were a lot of girls that thought we were kind of cute back then, so I guess you just keep going. I think that's how all of us kind of get started. But one thing led to another, and we got better. And then there used to be in my own developing, there was an Air Force base up in Chandler. It's closed now, but there was a gentleman named Sam Davis Jr., not the Sammy Davis, but he was the all-service vocal winner. And I think at the time, he'd played on or sang on the Ed Sullivan Show. Had a gorgeous voice, played a Hammond B3 organ. And we had a 12-string guitar player from Chicago. His name was Gary Wozniak, and they were both in the service. And Sammy lived in Worthington, and he knew that I drummed, and I ended up, my dad had to sign a waiver so I could play the bars with him. But we played kind of a jazz type of music, and I'd play over in Sioux Falls a lot, and I was, 16 years old. And just one thing led to another, and it was just a lot of fun.
I've heard people say, I've sometimes mentioned this myself when I'm talking to other people, but there was a pretty healthy music scene around this part of the country. And I like to think that at the core of that music scene was some of the ballrooms that were scattered throughout this part of the country. Now, do you remember any of the ballrooms, Tom?
Sure. Probably around here, two of the most famous ones. One was down in Okoboji, Iowa. It was called the Roof Garden. It was called the Roof Garden. And they'd get bands like the Buckinghams, and Sam the Sham and the Pharaohs were there when their number one hit was Wooly Bully, which is a song that Paul and I actually opened our 40-year reunion concert out at Duffy's here in Worthington. That was the song we started out with. And
now that was a heck of a tangent you just took us on. We'll come back to that.
Yeah,
all right.
Yeah. And then there was there was a place that none of us were ever supposed to go to. It was called the Hollyhock Ballroom. And that was up in Hatfield, sort of a little town kind of southeast of Pipestone. And that was big taboo, a lot of teenage drinking, and it was out in the country, and it was a pretty wild place. And then there was Valhalla up at Lake Chautauqua. There was the Showboat in Lake Benton. Just a lot of places that you could play, and then the Armory's in almost any town.
Sure.
Back then, they would book you in, and you'd see all these bands, and they were pretty good.
Well, I have a good memory of it. I tell people about that, but that's an era that's gone completely because you wouldn't find that. I used to kind of think, Tom, that the ballrooms around here, that ballroom circuit was kind of like the minor leagues for the music business because they send a lot of groups out here. I myself remember seeing Jerry Lee Lewis at the Hollyhock Ballroom. Now, I was underage, just like a lot of us guys were, so we snuck in. But he was on a pretty big swing back in those days, but his career hadn't really hit it like it eventually did. So he was kind of coming through. Same thing I could say with Tommy James and the Shondells. We saw them at I think the Showboat, and they had one of their hits out, but they went on. Was a bunch of stuff. So I think the labels used to send those groups out around here, find out how they do with the kids in the ballrooms, and if things were going, and they were selling their records, the label kept them going.
Yeah, it was just different back then, and like Paul said, I think that era is, it's gone. Now you hear these guys, they come on and they get a couple hits, and you better go see them while you can afford it, because everything just gets so far out of hand. But yeah, the day of live music, it kind of died off. It used to, every weekend you used to be able to go to these little supper clubs or bars around, and they'd have a little band in there, and everybody had fun, and then the bands kind of dwindled down. They didn't want to pay, and then they got the disco, or not the disco, but the disc jockeys and playing all that. We used to do a lot of wedding dances, and I still prefer live music to any of that. I think it's fun, and I love to see people get up and play. It doesn't really matter their skill level. I just think I think anybody that gets up and play is worthy of respect.
We got together in the band. I think you set it up earlier, Tom, with the group Scarlet Sun. But so you let me know. You tell me kind of how you saw your collaboration with Scarlet Sun Band and T.L.C. Summers and how we worked our way up through the. You tell me what your memories are about that operation those days.
Well, it was always somewhat awkward for me because my father had passed away and I was running the family business. And even though I was only a few years older than Paul, I can remember being the drummer, and all of a sudden they wanted to do the talent show at the high school. And of course, so there I am. I'm a businessman and playing with these guys with long hair, and
kids mean,
and we won. And then I'd leave and go back to work. So it was just a different time then. But Scarlet Sun was a lot of fun, and one thing led to another, and we kind of got out of the hard rock scene, and then Paul was the lead singer, and then I sang a lot. I don't think I was the lead singer, but Paul and I always had I think anyhow, we always had the ability to harmonize and to sing really well together, and it kind of ended up that both of us were kind of singing, and so we just kind of kept eliminating people.
Let's put a plug in for the other guys. So, all right, Jack Leslie.
Yep, Jack Leslie was our bass player. And we'll get back to him because he was kind of the last to go.
Kevin DeFries.
Yep, we had Kevin DeFries. He was our lead guitar player. Yeah. And Kevin's a doctor now, isn't he? A chiropractor, I think.
Yeah, he is. I think he's done pretty well.
Yeah.
Craig Silver was a drummer before, I think before you came along. Is that right? So you kind of took his place. And then there was a handful of a bunch of other people that came in and out of that band, but those were some of the early guys in the band. Yeah. So, all right. So you worked your way up through. We ended up with being a two-piece. What happened there?
Well, money's money, and Paul and I, we kept looking at these guys, and we thought, well, you know what? We're doing all the singing, and at the time, Paul was playing. I always say it was a B3, but I guess he corrected me. It was a B2, I think.
M3
or M3. Okay, M3. I don't know anything about organs, but it was an M3. He had a Leslie speaker, and so all of a sudden we went without a guitar player, and then we got down to Jack Leslie, our bass player, Tom Gilmore, that's me, and then, of course, Paul Summers. So we came up with the name T for Tom, Leslie, Jack's last name, and then Paul's last name, Summers. And we played together for quite a while. Well, then on the side, Paul and I started doing little commercials.
Oh, that's right. I'm glad you brought that up because we did have had a second life going.
Yeah, we had kind of a second little business.
Production company.
Yeah, a little production company. And Paul had a studio in his basement, and we'd do these little ditties for the local businesses.
Jingles.
And, jingles. And, we'd put them together, and it kind of, I don't know that we ever got paid a whole lot, but it was quite a bit of money back then probably. But we would put these together. It didn't take us very long, but one day we were sitting in the studio, it was just him and I, and we were kind of listening to the playback. We had the words down. Paul was playing the music. Some of them had drums, but most of them didn't even have drums. We just did the singing. And I said, it needs a little bit more. You need to get your bass pedals out. Get some bass pedals out. And he put the bass pedals to it, and we looked at each other, and I said, are you thinking what I'm thinking? And that was the end of Jack. And I haven't seen Jack in years, but Paul's stayed in contact with him, and I don't think there's no animosity or anything, but we told Jack, actually, the good news is we're going to keep your name. So Paul and I then went down to a two-piece, both sharing the singing duties, and we kept Jack's name for quite a few years. And we got pretty well known around here.
Oh, now if I said I had $100 in my pocket that I'm willing to give you, if you sang one of our old jingles, could you do it?
Well, we had I don't know if I could get all of it, but we did have a local drugstore, and when they built the big new mall here in Worthington, he opened up a drugstore out there. So his name was Doug Alf, and he was lived in Worthington a long time, very well known, and we came up with a little ditty, and I can't remember exactly how it goes, but it was something like this. Something for everyone, something for all Walgreen Drug, downtown and the mall, off Walgreen Drug.
Well, that's pretty good.
And the funny part, years, and I mean years later, I'm driving across South Dakota, and I've got my woman with me, and all of a sudden I go, for Christ's sakes, that's me on the radio. And here, it had to be at least 10, 12 years old, and they were still using it. And as we're coming across I-90 heading for Worthington, here I hear this goofy song that Paul and I had done. And, of course, we didn't have residuals or anything. But, that's kind of our history. We had a kind of a real interesting start to everything.
Hey, by the way, it was a good job on that jingle. It kind of it brought back some memories and stuff. Unfortunately, I don't have that $100 that I promised, but you were a trooper and you sang it pretty good. I'm going to give you credit for that. So
yeah,
no, we did a lot of jingles, and that's kind of an era gone by too. But so what I'm going to do, Tom, one of these days, I still have all those archives, all the old. Most of that stuff was done. I don't know if you remember that, but we had this 8-track.
Yep, the 8-track.
8-track multi-track tape recorder, Tascam. And so we recorded it on the bigger machine, then we bounced it down to 2-track, which is also a reel-to-reel machine. And so then everything was saved on these, eventually it came down to these little 8-inch reels and 6-inch reels. And so it's just tape, people don't even know it. Tape is half anymore, but that's how we used to do it. I've got those all saved in a warehouse, so I can get at them. I don't know if they'll play anymore, but I'm going to try and pull them out. Some of the stuff was on cassette too, so a lot of those old demos.
We're going way back.
This is way back. So anyway, so okay, so now those are some great memories. But so now there was a big stretch in between those days and what we did here just a couple of months ago, right?
Mm-hmm.
What happened in between for you? Well, I'll give my story here later on. But so what are we talking about? A 30-year stretch, Tom? A 40-year stretch?
40 years. Well, my father had passed away, and I took over the family business, and I still stayed in music for a while. I played in some other bands with some other people, but, those are, I think one band was called the Trade Winds, and we had a guitar player that he worked out. He was a produce manager at a local grocery store, and, just your typical small town stuff. But then eventually, I had a family and I was an avid golfer, and I just didn't have time anymore. So I basically kind of retired from all of that scene and kept track of Paul, and I'd check in, not necessarily with Paul, but I'd kind of watch and see what he was doing. And then I ran into him, I don't know, years after that, because, Paul had moved on and he had his career going and a family, and one thing led to another. And a couple of years ago, he called me up and said that they were back in Worthington, and he had a lot of people telling him that you got to get back together with Gilmore and do something. Well, then we kind of let it lay I had some knee surgery and things just, they were still busy, but then the pandemic hit and so there was time and we started putting things together and we did this reunion gig at a local country club here, and it was interesting to say the least.
Well, what I think is really kind of nice about this, Tom, is that, we played music together, 40 years ago, and then we had a little sabbatical that was probably 30 years to 40 years in between there. And we got back together again and played. And I think, what did we practice 2 or 3 times? Really, that was about it. But it came back pretty naturally.
Yeah. Well, and the interesting thing is we kind of put together a song list but a lot of people from Worthington, they remembered us and they remembered a lot of the songs. Well, unfortunately, we knew a lot of those songs or knew parts of them, but we didn't rehearse those. So we only made it into this reunion concert, about 4 or 5 songs where all of a sudden we're doing requests and we couldn't remember all the verses. So we just sing the same verse over. But you know what? Everybody had fun. Didn't matter. And that's really what music is supposed to be. Bring people together. Yeah. People have a good time. We missed some notes, but I doubt if anybody out in the audience probably really didn't care. They were all having a good time.
Well, you know what? So there's 40 years that passed from when we started doing this up until now, and so I always knew, Tom, that you were able to tell a pretty good story, and I always considered you high on the list of conversationalists. I got Tom with me. This is the Tom and Paul Show. I just named that right now, by the way. we'll see where it goes.
I like that you put my name first.
Well, it's going to cost you later on.
Yeah,
so you
I'll
know.
bet.
Okay.
I'll bet.
Well, yeah, I've told the Brulé story to anybody that knows this, and anybody that's probably listened to the podcast or listened to us talk here has probably heard parts of the story. So I'm going to keep my end short here, but I always tell people that I started out in Worthington, which I'm proud of, and I got my early experience, in music here. My first instrument was the accordion. Tom, I think you asked me if I ever would pick that back up again, and I will. I'd love to. But I had a weird little twist in my life. I was an adopted kid and found out at some point in my life that I discovered my true heritage. My mom and dad, and Tom can probably verify this, he knew Irma and Clarence, but, they were wonderful parents, but they told me I was French-Canadian, and there was never anything wrong with that. Most of the people in town knew that or thought that. Turns out that after I lost both of my parents, my wife discovered my adoption papers, and of course one thing led to another. We ended up finding our family back on the Lower Brule Sioux Reservation, and first thing you know, Tom, is we're officially back into the Native American world, found a biological family, and looked for a way to assimilate back into that culture. And boom, the group Brulé came out of that because I stayed in music and wanted to express the experience that I had gone through. So there was how Brulé started. Now, while that's going on, I know that you kind of heard our name pop up once in a while. So what was from the outside world looking in and from somebody who we kind of grew up together, what was going through your head when you heard of this group Brulé and the Summers kid? And you must have thought, what in the heck is this guy going through?
Well, first off, I got to tell you a little bit about my family. My family, the Gilmore family, grew up in Pipestone, Minnesota, and famous for pipestone. They make peace pipes out of. I guess that's not the proper term anymore.
It's good. It's okay.
Is it okay?
Yeah.
I know they call them different things now. But so I was always around Native American Indians. I used to go out with my dad and my Uncle Willard, and we'd go out to the quarry there, and we'd actually watch them quarry stuff. And they used to have a pageant there called the Hiawatha pageant. That's and right. My uncle, he did all the lighting for that. He was with Northern States Power at the time, and it was quite a pageant. They had a guy dive off a big cliff, and there's the three maidens. They're the big stones that are there, and there's a lot of history there at that national monument. But when I found out about all this with Paul, he wrote a book. I was a little upset that I wasn't in the book, but no. But anyhow, I've always loved the Indian culture, and unbeknownst to Paul, over the years, I've got many books on the Indians. I collect Indian pottery, and I've always felt, I don't know, kind of a kinship. Maybe it was just because when I was a little boy, I just looked up to these people so much. And when I found out about Paul and they started Brulé, and I found out that they were getting out there and getting successful and putting their message out, I found a real sense of pride. I was really proud of Paul that he was able to do that and get in touch and could not even imagine what his journey was like. I mean, I don't know that Paul was ever, and Paul could speak to that, I don't know that he was ever torn between the two, but I'm sure there were times when he probably was a little confused and really wasn't sure what happened to him. I can tell you this, Paul is a very, back when we played, he was just like any other, he was a kid, and, we played, and, Paul had a family, and we were young, but now Paul has found at least in my view, he's a very spiritual person, and I think I've become a better person just reconnecting with him and playing music again, and I'd like to think that he enjoys it too. I mean, we're never going to have the commercial success that Brulé had, but I don't think that's really what either one of us are in this for. We enjoy playing together. We like singing together. We like seeing people smile and having fun, and so all those years, I guess I just kind of followed him. I never ever thought I was going to get a phone call, to be honest. But I've been it's just like I've turned into a kid again. I have a friend that plays drums, and he ended up selling me one of his drum sets, and I've really gotten back into music. I'm starting to write a few things, and for all the years that Paul has wrote all that music, and I have a lot of his CDs, some of it needs words to it, and I'm going to really work hard and try to get some of that done. And
that's pretty cool, Tom. So what you're saying, and this is the first, right? So what you're saying is that you're going to tackle that task and see where it takes you.
Yeah.
And see if you can spin maybe a line. I know you're a good lyricist. I've known that since I told you that from the very beginning. And I just have never had that skill myself or that knack. So maybe that'll be kind of interesting to see where that ends up.
Yeah, well, you're young, and I used to draw, and I used to write poetry and stuff. But then kind of life gets in the way for a while. You got to make money. You're raising kids, and you kind of lose it. But it never really goes away. It just hides from you for a while. And if nothing else, I guess getting back with Paul's just opened up a lot of things to me. I'm viewing my own life differently. I'm 73, so I'm like I said, I'm an avid golfer. I'm not very good anymore, but I know I'm on the back nine, and this has just been kind of a rebirth for me, and I'm just enjoying the heck out of it. I'm having a ball.
I think you got a few more rounds to go in you. So
well, I hope so.
Okay, listen, Tom. Thank you very much for that sentiment, and it's nice to hear you say that. And I think that you've always had a pretty spiritual nature. Maybe it's changed a little bit over the recent history here. If so, I think that's kind of neat to see, because we all change and to grow and develop as our lives go by.
Yeah. So, Paul, the other question I had, just looking from afar, you all of a sudden you guys did the big show out there at Mount Rushmore, and how did that all come about?
And I said, well, all right, so you can tell I don't even hardly know where to start with that. It should be simple. It should be an easy answer to it. But essentially, I'll try to break it down and without getting too lengthy. We had been playing it out in the Black Hills area. And one of our regular haunts out there was Crazy Horse Memorial. We'd stop there 2 or 3 times every summer, and sometimes we get paid, sometimes we wouldn't. Sometimes we get they'd let us in, sometimes we just wouldn't make the cut, You never quite knew. We happened to be up there one summer when some of the people from the Regis and Kathy Lee crew, they had a morning talk show back in those days, and they knew ahead of time that they were going to be doing a live show at Mount Rushmore, so they sent an advanced team out to check some things out to put that show together. And one of their stops was Crazy Horse. We just happened to be there that day, that hour that they were coming through, and they didn't even talk to us then. We got a phone call like 6 months later from somebody that just said they'd seen us at Mount Rushmore, wanted to know if we would be interested in being on part of this TV production. And we said, yeah. And so that's how it happened. That's how the invitation came up. And so, that itself is the timing for that to actually happen, was 1 in a million, honestly. But that's like the tip of the iceberg. The actual making the show happen was a whole another thing I don't know if we want to go there or not, but, that's how we got the invite to come play there.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. Sometimes it's just luck. Or you're in the right spot at the right place, or sometimes you're in the wrong spot at the wrong time or whatever. But, yeah, it's funny how things work out.
Well, it sure wasn't a decision made by a hotshot manager or a booking agent or a talent agency or a record company. Mm-hmm. None of those. That's typically how that would have happened. Promotional company. I mean, Mount Rushmore. I mean, it could have been any of those. Hey, Tom, here's something else. When we got the invite to be a part of the show up there, and by the way, we were what they call the musical guests. So we had one little segment during the show, but most of our stuff we did was bumpers coming in and out of their commercials. And so we hadn't yet completely opened up the door into Mount Rushmore. So we were like one of the first Native American, performances to take the stage up there on the main amphitheater at the base of the heads of the presidency.
Yeah.
So that was tricky too.
Well, thank you for sharing that with us, because sometimes I don't know if it's a divine intervention or what, but that's just a wonderful thing. And really, in some respects, it's kind of a double-edged sword. There you are above a monument on some of the most sacred ground to your people.
Yeah.
And
well, we had, believe me, there was those in the culture that kind of watched what we were doing, and they weren't exactly 100% favorable with their critique of our performance up there. And so, we had to kind of play that, we had to play that hand carefully. And, as time went by, we knew that the test of time would let us know if it was acceptable or not. And as the years went by, I would say, Tom, really, though, it took about 7 years after that performance with Regis and Kathy Lee to evaluate if it was the right thing to do, if it worked, if it made a dent, if it made an impact in the culture, if it made an impact in the world. And so, yeah, it all happened in 45 minutes, and we probably played a total of 4.5 minutes altogether over that 45-minute show. And so when you think about that, it's not much time to make a
well,
dent.
and just looking at the climate that we live in now, with all this wokeism, who knows if it would have ever happened? You might have, you don't know, but you might have had so much pressure from your community to not do this. And thank God you did, because I think it was a genesis to start bringing the people together and then bringing them together through music. What better thing? And there's something, Paul, that I don't even know how to put it in words, but I can just tell, and I tell these listeners, and I'm not trying to promote Brulé, but there are songs there that just move me. And in some respects, we're all Native Americans. I mean, hell, we said, "What are you?" I said, "I'm an American. That's where I was born." But there's something about that area. There's something about the whole Midwest that you don't find anywhere else.
No, and I can tell you that for a fact. We've traveled. Well, you have too, Tom. We've both traveled around. We've been around the world a time or two, and there is something about it. I've always felt like the culture still has. The Native American culture still has a lot to share with the world, has a lot to give the world. And as times change, the welcoming hands, for that thing that we're trying to give the world isn't always been so receptive. I mean, there's been a need for it. I think the need now is greater than ever. Will anybody, find it and accept it? That's the question. A handful of people who have got their eyes wide open kind of see that and recognize it. But in one of our future shows, Tom, we talked about the Regis and Kathy Lee thing. Let's talk about how that 1 in a million little slot, how that brought us up to the actual concert for reconciliation of the cultures, which happened in 2007. That was another monumental moment for the culture and for Brulé, and the chances of that happening ever again probably are zero. That had to happen right at that particular time. There was maybe a 3-year window when that could have happened in entire history. Or I'm not talking about just recent history. I'm talking about, I don't care if you want to go back 800 years up till right now. I'm telling you, there was about a 3-year slot where that actually could have happened, and it did happen. And sometimes when you think, we just happened to be standing there at that time and happened to have this invite to open up the door a little bit. They happened to have a park ranger there who was the first Native American superintendent. All that stuff had to click before we were really given the green light to go do that. But that's a whole other story.
Yeah, and I would like to think that there was a reason that happened, and it was supposed to happen, and it's only going to be for the better of everybody.
Well, we'll dive into that one of our next shows. How's that sound?
Sounds great. Well, hello again, and this is Tom Gilmore. I'm here with Paul Summers, or Paul LaRoche. I guess he can go by both. To me, he'll always be Paul Summers, but I respect, both sides of that. And I guess that's what I'd like to get into. Paul, I can't even imagine. First off, it's tough. When I knew both Clarence and Irma, and they were wonderful, wonderful parents. They were your mom and dad, but they weren't your mother or your father. And I can kind of relate to that same thing. My ex-wife and I, we had a newborn or a baby when we were in high school, gave him up for adoption. We later reconnected. And that's what I always told my son. I said, just remember, you have a dad and mom. Anybody can be a mother and a father. And, so I can only imagine when Paul found out about all this, he had to really be probably somewhat confused, probably a little bit scared, probably a little nervous. So I don't know, Paul, you tell me, what was it like when you first found out that you weren't French Canadian and that you were adopted and you were American Indian?
Well, it's a life-changing experience, first of all, and it happens. I don't know if you've ever heard the term a paradigm shift, but what's going on there is that what they're talking about with that term is that you look at something with your eyes, you see it one way. It could just be a little pyramid on a table, and maybe you've looked at that as a pyramid, but you're only seeing it from the front. And so when you finally realize that it's not a pyramid, it's just two-dimensional, it's just a piece of paper laying there as a triangle, you go, I've looked at that thing, I thought it was a three-dimensional pyramid my whole life. And some of you may just, finally somebody turned the page and showed me that it's not. Well, that's kind of what I went through when I made that discovery. But to dig right into your question about, finding out about being a different, a different genetic background, it didn't really hit me. It took quite a few years for that to really land and to sink in. It took me a while to digest. But here's one thing I would like to say, and I'm glad you asked the question because I'm an adoptee. I've talked to a lot of adoptees over the years, and everyone's got a different story. My story, and I'm not the only one that shares this sentiment, but for me, Irma and Clarence were my mom and dad, just like you'd mentioned. And I really had very little interest in finding. Well, I'll put it this way. My biological mother and father were no longer alive when this came up, which probably was the way for it to go, because that would have been a whole nother chapter in this thing. But, and here's one other thing, and then I'll give the microphone back to you. Without Kathy being involved in the search to go back and to discover that family, I would have never had the constitution to do it. She was the one that felt she had the intuition that there was something of greater significance to that discovery than just finding a different family. And for me, it was just like, I already have a mom and dad. I don't really feel like I need to find other siblings or family. I had no desire. And part of that was because I was still in the grieving process early on for the loss of both parents. It later, of course, went on to be a good discovery. But for me, it was the assistance of my wife, Kathy, that really brought that reunion. And in the end, she was responsible, I guess you could say, for the entire Brulé journey. Hey, that was pretty good timing.
Yeah, it sure was. Well, Kathy, was, and I've known Kathy not quite as long as Paul, but basically I've known Kathy all my life too. Her father was a businessman, and actually he was a customer of mine, and I think, and I don't mean this in a bad way towards Paul, but Kathy was really Paul's rock, and I think Paul will tell you that she was really a driving force. She stood by him, and if you've read his book, it wasn't all good times. Tough times,
sure.
Hard times.
Oh, yeah.
And you're kind of tore between two worlds, but she was the one constant, and to this day still is. And, so not only have I been able to be fortunate enough to reconnect with Paul, but we've reconnected with Kathy too. And that's just kind of the way it should have been. My ex-wife was in the delivery room when they had their first baby. And so there's a lot of kind of different connections, and it's fun. And now you got a beautiful son, young man. He's not a little boy by any stretch, and the connection is just there. But I can't even pretend to know how you felt about everything, because I'm sure there was waves of waves of thoughts and feelings that you didn't know exactly how to handle, and they probably changed, and it's probably kind of fluid.
Well, there's two parts to that question, Tom. There was the emotional part, I think, and the spiritual part. And yeah, our kids have been along, Shane and Nicole, both of them have been part of this journey from the very beginning, and we're behind this whole thing. But the other part of it was, separate from the spiritual part and the personal part was the artistic side, which honestly, I had no interest in pursuing this whole thing artistically. It was designed, in the long run to be more of a spiritual journey. And so the whole thing with taking the music, some of the music that we had grown up with, and in this case, you and I, some of that early music that we played, I don't care if it was Sam the Sham or whether it was the Beatles, that music carried over and somehow had to merge and morph into the Native American culture. And that opens up a whole other chapter, Tom. I mean, people still to this day will kind of ask, where did the inspiration for your songs come from? I think you asked me one time, and I don't know how I answered it back at that time, but every little piece of music I always kind of felt like was a little story in its own musically. At least it was for me. Like I said before, I'm not a lyricist, so it was just the melodies and tunes, and they're kind of hard to come up with. As a matter of fact, you can't really do it unless there's something at work in your life spiritually. It could be positive, it could be negative, but they both have the same result. If it's a heavy, deep emotion, it's going to generate some kind of. You need an outlet for that, and in our case, it was the music, those little melodies that you kind of listen to once in a while. I know you've listened to some of our music. Each one was created. Maybe one was on the top of a bluff on the Black Hills, and one might have been on the open prairie as the thunderstorm came rolling across the plains, and another one could have been down in the Southwest as we were standing down there in the middle of the Hopi Reservation. I mean, it all had its inspirations to create a piece of music.
Well, it's a journey that most people never get a chance to really take. It's almost like you had two lives. You were raised in the so-called white man's world, and then all of a sudden you found out that you were Indian, and so you're kind of two people mixed in one, and what a beautiful thing. And it comes out in your music. I think you've said it that probably one of the biggest and most satisfying things about your music is you hope that it can just help to bring people together and just kind of enjoy each other.
Well, I mean, I think an artist hopes that they can accomplish something like that with their artwork. I don't care if it's visual art or if it's a photography or if it's music, and you hope that it affects somebody else. But you don't set out to create it for that purpose. You do it to try to express that part of your life, and then after it's what I found out anyway is once you've given it a birth, once you've given it life. Then you sit back a little bit and take a breath, and it's only at that time you kind of go, well, I wonder if anybody's gonna enjoy that, and it's kind of a secondary thought. So it's nice when somebody does enjoy what you've done, but a lot of the struggles, Tom, with Brulé, had to do with the fact that here we are in the music industry, which still hasn't totally bought into the idea of our culture, Native America, being a team player in the big leagues. So if we hit obstacles over the last, 30 years, I would say, we've opened up a lot of doors and we've made a lot of progress and we've had, what I would consider to be plenty of success. But the obstacles are still out there. The obstacles have always been the mainstream entertainment industry. They've just never quite accepted what's happening here. They've never really let us be part of the major leagues, and it's not to be meant to a fault. But if you can believe this, I don't think they know what to do with a group like Brulé.
Yeah, there's really, I think you've said this before, there's really no category. There's really no one else doing that kind of music. And even take it down to the instruments. You play piano. Well,
where does that fit into the culture?
Yeah, where does that come in? and then your daughter, Nicole, a flutist that plays a steel flute, but she plays it kind of Indian style. So it's a unique sound, very talented. So everything about you is kind of, it's both worlds, kind of mixed in, and what comes out of it is really a beautiful thing.
Well, thanks for that observation and mentioning that. It means a lot when it comes from someone like you, because you followed it and you've seen where its origins were at. I think the really tough thing that still remains out there today is for the mainstream entertainment industry to take notice of what's going on here. I mean, think about it, Tom, and help me out here. Try to think of a culture around the world, anywhere. I don't care if it's the Celtics, if it's the Germans, if it's down in the Caribbean part of the country, if it's Brazil. They all have their traditional sounds, right? Mm-hmm. But they've been able to bring them up into the pop world, and they all have their contemporary counterparts to their traditional music. And most of them are huge categories. I mean, I'm just going to pick on the Latin music explosion, which had its origins back when we were kind of coming up through the ranks back in the 70s and 80s. It was huge. Now, there's kind of a smaller culture, subculture I call it, that carved out its own sound and it took off like gangbusters. I mean, look at Irish music that became, Celtic music. I don't care if it's Celtic Christmas, or I don't care if it's river dance.
Yeah.
Just went off the charts. Now, we can go around the whole world and bring it up. But when it comes to Native America, you got to go, hold on a second. What are these guys doing? Where's their
Yeah, there's not a lot.
No, not a lot. If you can come up with the number of acts that are fingers on your hands, I'd be surprised.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. Well, like you said, the industry really doesn't know what to do with you guys.
Well,
there's really no category.
No, and we're not young kids anymore, Tom. That's starting out here, and now when I look back at the next generation coming up, it's kind of hard to. I'm hopeful, but it seems like a lot of the younger generation in our culture, they have this thing where they're not so interested in trying to work on that blending of the cultures. So in other words, taking the traditional, keeping it contemporary. They want to be hip hop. They want to be a rapper. They want to be hip hop artists. They'd rather be in a country band than anything else. And so
hard rockers, blues.
Yeah, blues. You've heard of all. I mean, there's more blues. There's more Indian blues bands than there are what you would call a group like Brulé. So I'm not sure where it's going to go. I'm hopeful, but we'll have to see. What the next generation is able to come up with.
Well, I hope that Brulé is kind of a starting point for young Native American musicians to get some inspiration from, actually, and take it even farther. And sometimes that's all it takes.
Well, maybe it is. And you kind of give me hope there with those words. So we'll see where it goes. Tom, I tell you what, I've enjoyed this conversation. Once again, Tom Gilmore and Paul Summers, the two of us here. We had our origins back in the old days, and we're still doing some things together. But I'd like to continue this conversation on at some different times if we can, Tom. And I'd like to have you kind of be the sounding board for me, and I'll do the same for you. And together, why don't we explore some of the mystical things about the Native American culture? We can talk about some of the spiritual things. We can talk about some of the. Obviously, I think music is kind of right at the top of the list for things we could discuss. There's other really cool things that need to be talked about a little bit. You and I talked about a conversation about the Black Hills, what's happening out there. You mentioned Pipestone. There's a lot of stuff we could talk about Pipestone. We could go right across the Midwest here. And cover a few topics.
Very interesting. Lots of. I don't want to say remnants, but there's all kinds of history here, and there's rock carvings. I mean, there's just all kinds of stuff that a lot of people aren't even aware of.
Well, let's explore some of that. What do you think? Let's chase that down.
Sounds good.
Well, let's see if we can continue this on and see if anybody will enjoy our conversations. Yeah. And I know I have.
Yeah, I have too.
All right. Well, we'll say thank you to everybody who's been listening out there. Yeah. This is Paul.
This is Tom.
We'll see you next time.
Bye-bye.